Today we're going to talk about the part of yourself that you may have been neglecting or ignoring for some time now. So we know from the research and the work of Dr. Susan Johnson and emotionally focused couples therapy that every single one of us has a vulnerable side, something vulnerable that we need in relationships to be as content as possible. But we're all pretty ashamed and insecure about our vulnerabilities. So instead of putting those needs on the table and asking our partners to honor our vulnerable side, we actually do the opposite. We take those vulnerabilities and we try to hide them from our partners because, of course, we don't want to look at them either. But so long as we fail to acknowledge our vulnerable needs, and as we neglect them and fail to advocate for them, they're going to continue to manifest in our lives or in our relationships in some pretty ugly or destructive ways. Now, I would love to tell you that my experience with these neglected, vulnerable parts of ourselves is just purely professional, but that would be a bold-faced lie. So I learned this lesson the hard way in my marriage to Bill. So Bill's a good guy who loves to do whatever he can to try to make me happy. And in the early years of our marriage, when I was longing for a baby and asked him if we could become parents, he would have been perfectly content waiting to have kids, but he said yes. Well, then a mere 10 days after I gave birth to our daughter, I was laid off from my job. We lost half of the income we were relying upon, and the terrorist attacks of September 11th occurred that very same week. So in the economic recession that followed for months and months afterwards, there weren't any new jobs to be found. So you can imagine what a stressful time this was in my household. It was incredibly tense, and I felt so insecure that for the first time in my adult life, as a strong, independent, educated woman, I couldn't even support myself financially, let alone support the newborn child I had just brought into the world. So I relied on my dominant side, my strength and my independence, and I did what I thought strong, independent women do. I took on as much as I possibly could, and I tried to need as little from Bill as possible. Okay, so I should probably also tell you that at the time, I really had it out for those quote-unquote needy women. You know, the ones that always seem to have their partner by their side and don't seem to be able to do anything by themselves and can't leave the house without their sweetie by the side. Even if they're just running down to the corner store to grab a gallon of milk for 10 minutes, they want their partner there. Yeah, those women. I hated them. And honestly, it's because at the time, I secretly envied them. I did. I had always longed for more engagement, more connection, more quality time with Bill. But I didn't think it was okay to ask for that. I thought that if I asked for that, that would make me one of them. So I tried very hard to ignore that part of myself. And for a while, it was pretty easy. Because you see, I was raised in a household where my father overworked every single day of my life. And he never did stop to get to know me at all. And so his behavior taught me from an early age that it wasn't okay to need quality time. It wasn't okay to need connection and engagement. And so long before I met Bill, I had learned how to take that vulnerable side of myself who did want more and shove her in a dark corner and ignore her. Well, that layoff back in 2001 actually became an amazing catalyst in my life. That's when I decided to enroll in graduate school to become a licensed psychotherapist, which opened the doorway for founding Flourish. But as you can imagine, going to graduate school with a toddler at home, those were interesting times. And it was then that Bill became convinced that he had married Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Yeah. So we weren't able to really afford daycare back then. So I was at home with the baby all day, every day. And honestly, I loved being at home with her. And I would squeeze in my graduate school assignments where I could. And Bill would go to work, and he'd often call me from the office at the end of the day. And he would say, honey, I'm not going to come home tonight. Before I come home, I'm going to go for a mountain biking ride, which is his favorite form of self-care and stress relief. And strong, independent Angela would reply to him and say, oh, babe, yeah, that's great. Go take care of yourself. That's good. Hey, what time can I expect you home to help out with the baby? And he would say, usually something defensive about he didn't know how long it would take, how long this trail was. He would be stressed out if he had to give me a time, and so he would refuse to give me a time. Well, those of you who have little people know that by the daylight hours, hanging out with a baby is kind of the cutest thing on planet Earth. But come the witching hour of the evening, being at home with a baby alone after you've been there taking care of her for 14 hours a day, there was nothing cute about those hours. And the later in the day it would get, the fussier the baby would get, and she would whine and she wouldn't let me put her down, and the more worn out and stressed out I would become. So strong, independent Angela would just leave my body, and what would move in instead was that vulnerable side of me who felt alone in my marriage and in raising this child, and who was just at her breaking point and needed more support. And she was pissed that her needs weren't getting met. And so even though I had graciously offered Bill my well wishes just hours earlier before he left for his ride, this poor man would take one step inside the door. And all it took was one cold, hard glare from me for him to know that we were pissed. And I would launch into a criticism, and he would launch into defensiveness, and we would go round and round. And that's what our cycle looked like. Now, in relationships of the highest form, both partners have to learn about their own vulnerable needs and teach one another about them. So then you can work together as a team to create win-win strategies, right? So that both people's needs are getting met. Not one partner's needs get met at the cost of the other. So in hindsight, I might have been able to say something to Bill like, you know what, sweetie, I really know how important it is to you to get out on your bike. That's great. But listen, I've already been home alone with this baby for 14 hours, and if you get home past 6 p.m., I'm going to start swigging red wine out of the bottle just to try to hold it together. So what do you say we make it 6 p.m. and not 8 p.m., and then maybe this weekend we can find time for you to slip away and ride a longer trail. How about that? That would have been a workable win-win strategy, except that at the time, I was so ashamed of that vulnerable side of myself that I was still trying to hide it from him. So, here's what I want you to know. Hiding your vulnerable needs from your partner is part of what is feeding your negative cycle. It's part of the problem. It's not part of the solution. And it's also getting in the way of the two of you having the emotional intimacy that you're capable of achieving. Because when you really let your partner get in close to you and get to know you better than anybody else, there has to be room at the table for both sides of you. You get to bring that strong, independent, competent side that is your strength and your comfort zone. That gets to be there for sure. But you also have to bring that vulnerable part of you to the table. And there's got to be space for you to identify those needs and disclose them to them, and then advocate that those needs be met. That, my friends, is the definition of being whole while being in a relationship. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.